This is Bringing the Darkness to the Light with Catherine Nadal, professional psychic medium.
Today's guest is Dr. Cal Cooper. He is an associate professor of psychology at the University of Northampton. He lectures on parapsychology, positive psychology, thanatology, sexual behavior, and social psychology. He is the author and editor of 5 books to date, including Telephone Calls from the Dead and the Psi and Psychotherapy, and over 100 papers and articles. He is the recipient of such awards as the Eileen J. Garrett Scholarship 2009 Parapsychology Foundation, a runner-up to the Ockham's Rogo Award, the Skeptic QEDcon 2018, and the D. Scott Rogo Award for Media 2021 Parapsychology Foundation. Such a pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here. It's good to see you again and hear your voice.
Yes.
It's been a long time since Durham.
Yes, I actually think that it's the D. Scott Rogo Award. Is that correct? I think I mispronounced it.
It is the D. Scott. It's the D. Scott Rogo Award. It's the Ockham's Razor Award, and then thanatology is in the Greek god Thanatos. So Greek god,
okay.
The god of death. So Thanatos is study of death, dying, and bereavement.
Oh, wow. Well, you are definitely going to be one of my top fascinating guests tonight. You and I know each other from the Forever Family Foundation. We also know each other from the Rhine University, which is actually in Durham, North Carolina. As a certified psychic medium, I've had the chance to be in your company and listen to you speak. I actually met you at the Rhine, and that was probably about 10 years ago. But every time I've heard you speak, I learned so much. There's so much on the internet about you. There's so many interviews that you've done by YouTube. So this is going to be filled with a lot of questions for our audience, because I think you have really taken a lot of your mission into researching, but also in sharing and educating. And to me, that's really the key to spreading out the word. And so probably just to make sure that people have the right information and not necessarily the misinformation. A lot of times people think they know about something, or like me, mispronounce something. So I really appreciate that. So thank you again for being here.
It's okay, my pleasure. Did we meet twice? Did you come to the Rhine Research Centre when I spoke about Alex Tannis at Duke University? Yes,
I think we have met twice, and I've actually heard you speak more on YouTube than I've seen you in person. But I'm really fascinated with you. What I don't know about you is about how you grew up.
To a legal level, I hope. I hope you're not kind of going through my bins or anything like that, looking for receipts and everything.
No, but there are aspects of your life that I don't know enough about. So let's go to your childhood. As a little girl, I was psychic, and I struggled with that because I was having dreams that were coming true, and my family really wasn't supportive of it, especially my dad. So how did you kind of get involved in finding out about ghosts or finding out about, things that would be psychic in nature in your family as a young child?
So growing up was good for me. I had a very supportive family. My mum is a retired midwife and my dad's a retired factory owner, textile technologist. So we was producing a lot of stuff for athletics and walking gear and stuff like that for people. So it was good, but schooling never really did anything for me. My dad believed in private education and my sister liked that. That was the kind of route she went down. But I was more free with my education. I realized that the more public sector was offering more variety and more socializing that worked for me. So when I got to college, I was exploring psychology, photography, filmmaking, British Sign Language, extracurricular things that I wanted to do. But it was in school that I had a couple of supportive teachers that liked the idea of ghosts and hauntings and knew there was a serious subject there. And every time we went to the library once a week, I would sit with a group of friends and we'd go through the 5 or 6 ghost books that they actually had in the library that would mainly be on Fortean phenomena, so named after Charles Fort. And it'd be Bigfoot, the Loch Ness Monster, UFOs, and that's where Jeff the Talking Mongoose came up, which was one of the ghost hunter Harry Price's investigations. And there were mentions of Borley Rectory, which was meant to be the most haunted house in Essex, that he investigated. So that was my kind of in to parapsychology. And there were also local pamphlets. They're really kind of low budget, stapled together little pamphlets by a lady called Jane Peters, who was the local ghostwriter. So when I read those, I was fascinated that these just seemed to be very honest and sincere of the experiences that they'd had. Now, that wasn't my career choice. I was getting into acting and performing arts. But later on, when I'd done college, 16 to 18, and I was having to pick universities, there were quite a few in the UK catering for this, with a third-year optional module in parapsychology. Even Coventry University at that time was doing a master's degree in parapsychology. But I thought, do a psychology degree. If you still want to do acting, you can use that degree to fall back on because you could apply it to a number of things. But as much as I regret in some ways, I never returned to acting, even though it's my absolute passion. But my passion was also for why people have these experiences. And I seem to have established myself quite well in this area of psychology. And I've stayed with it. Maybe I would have had the same kind of experience of income, being in dribs and drabs here and there, wherever you find it and wherever people want you. I feel like I'm the showman again, because a lot of my passion and interest in parapsychology is reaching out to the media and doing that outreach and working with the public and networking and meeting groups of people. I don't like being tied down to the classroom too much. I like to be out there meeting people, collecting data, doing research.
Yeah, I think that's really great. You know, it's interesting about you because even in watching the YouTube videos, you have a presence about you, but you have like a natural instructor. Like you literally are talking to the audience, you keep them engaged, but you're instructing them. So that's kind of interesting the way you say that. I think you would have done just as well as an actor, but I think this is more fascinating for your personality probably to be discovering things that are more factual. You know, being an actor, you may be not necessarily always living in the factual world, right? You're playing some nonfiction, you know, fiction, different characters that may or may not, you know, really resonate with you. So I think that's kind of interesting.
It works. You know, when I'm talking about the history of any aspect of parapsychology, and I know of certain events that took place, then it's like I'm performing it out to the audience. I don't just say what happened. I kind of play the role and I say, you know, and they walked into Ryan's office and this was said and Alex Tannis was doing this, but he turned around and said, and I try and kind of give them that kind of lived world experience of this is how the interaction was happening. All you need is a photograph of some aspect of that event and then bring it to life for them by you playing it. It's great if you've got video clips from, 50, 60 years prior. But if you haven't got that, then play the part for them. Because there's some wonderful stage plays where people have just done it based on a room because of a factual event that happened between some people. And that's all you get. And it's captivating sometimes when they're based on truth.
Yes, just for the sake of the audience, we're really going back in time. Just from listening to many conversations that you've had, we're going back to probably like 1882. Is that correct?
Well, with the Society for Psychical Research, I'm a council member of the SPR. And that was founded in 1882 by scholars at Trinity College, University of Cambridge. I'll be there all day next Tuesday. I'm doing some work in their archives at the library and then speaking in the evening to skeptics in the pub. And then the American branch of it was literally just the American Society for Psychical Research, was founded between 1884 to 1885 in New York by a number of eminent psychologists, physicists, philosophers, much like the British version. But notable people like William James. So, yeah, it does. In terms of establishing a working science, it goes back a long way.
Yes, and it's interesting, too, because you also had mentioned Rhine. So when did Rhine actually come about, if we look at the timeline in regards to years and how things kind of came together?
Well, there was a lot of back and forth over time. So the establishment of the American SPR in some ways was a response to the British SPR to say, no, there is nothing new to learn here. We will get together as scientists and show you the British scientists need. And in 10 years or so of their workings, they discovered that with some instances of mediumship, they couldn't see what was going on. They seemed to be some things that defied conventional explanation as it stood at the time. And so they ended up working on par with the British SPR from that point on. Later on, we're talking late teens to early 20s, Joseph Banks Rhine and Louisa Rhine, they were at the University of Chicago doing their PhDs in botany. And they were together, they were a couple. And Louisa was slightly older than Rhine, so she finished her PhD first. And they've become quite friendly with a Scottish scholar, William McDougall, who'd been based at Harvard University. And he'd done some of the initial tests of psychic phenomena, extrasensory perception, as Ryan later coined that term, ESP. But the Rhines were members of both SPR branches, and they attended a lot of seances. In Ryan's early life, his family wanted him to go into the priesthood, but he didn't. He turned to academia. But psychical research was this nice overlap to spiritualism. And with that, they got disillusioned by some mediums that came forward, particularly in the ASPR around that time, the late teens, early 20s. There was a medium by the name of Mina Crandon, and her husband was a doctor of chemistry, I think it was. He tended to host the seances, and they were very encouraging of the SPR members to get involved, the ASPR members. But her seances were bizarre. They would seem to be very, in some instances, sexually orientated towards some of the sitters. And in some of the reports, people could see baby arms protruding from her vagina during the seances. And there were a number of members that just believed that other members were just infatuated with her, and her husband was encouraging this in exchange for good reports of her psychic abilities. The Rhines just weren't having it, and many other members weren't either. And so this caused a complete divide, near 50% divide of the ASPR, to start a new branch, which was the Boston Society for Psychic Research. It took nearly 15, 20 years for many of those members from the BSPR to form back to the ASPR, and it diluted out the BSPR. But they just said, we're not going to have anything to do with the ASPR until you get rid of this medium and stop focusing on her because she's nonsense. But that controversy went on for ages. The Rhines lost heart because of stuff like that, and also because Rhine was finding as best he could the best mediums that seemed to defy what magicians and escapologists, who were also psychical researchers, could see what was going on in the seances. And he did find one medium, I can't remember their name, but no one could figure out seemingly what was going on. And he was in contact with Albert Einstein, who was interested. And he said, look, if you find a good medium, one that you think is really legit, I will come and visit, and I'll bring 2 of my research assistants, and I'd love to see it. And so Ryan was quite confident in this medium. Einstein came along, and so Einstein lost interest, but he did sort of dabble. He wrote the foreword to Upton Sinclair's book, Mental Radio. And so there are some overlaps for Einstein and ESP, but in terms of Ryan's correspondence, it fell away by that point. So then came William McDougall. He comes back on the scene, and he is offered a post as a dean of psychology and the social sciences at Duke University, knows the Rhines well, and said, how about you come and join the faculty? You finished your PhDs, come and join the faculty at Duke University. I would like a lab establishing for psychical research, and I'd like you to rename it, rebrand it, and get the world to start recognizing this as an actual science within the universities. So they adopted the German term that had been used of parapsychology, translated it to English. So para meaning beyond, and psychology, study of the mind and brain. So beyond the mind and brain, essentially that branch that is dealing with the areas of human behavior and experience that we don't currently understand. So we need to try and figure it out, see what's going on, understand these processes. And with that, they had a whole laboratory, the Duke Parapsychology Laboratory, which is still there. The building that was the lab is on Duke University campus still. And over the years, we now have what remains, which is the Rhine Research Centre. But it was by the late 1920s that the Rhines had established themselves there. They got this structured methodology for testing psychic phenomena using what's known as the Zener cards, or Zener cards as people know them. Star, cross, wavy line, circle, and square. You see them immortalized in Ghostbusters at the start, where Peter Venkman is using those to essentially chat up one of the female students. But that's where the Rhines became established, and that's where parapsychology sidestepped from psychical research, which was still investigating hauntings, doing surveys, going to see mediums. They got parapsychology in the lab, a lot of number crunching, a lot of repetition, a lot of very boring studies over a long period of time, but it was using statistics, it was using social science methods, and a lot of what they were doing to avoid error and cheating got integrated into the rest of standardized psychology. So that's where it took place.
I'm so glad you gave such detail in all of that. So that really clarifies the people involved. You know, it's interesting because I've also heard you speak about Thomas Edison. So how did Thomas Edison come into this with his idea of creating?
Well, he didn't much. There's some bits written on it. and it's very flaky and fleeting. He had some, I think they were Polish American lab assistants, and some of them professing to be mediums. He was very selective of who was getting involved in his lab, and his parents were spiritualists as well. And as many of the listeners would know, Thomas Edison produced a vast amount of inventions that came forward. He was well known for that, especially things like the electric light bulb being one of the pioneers for that. And he was very paranoid about his inventions. He was very secretive about them and didn't want people to know about them. And in the evenings, he allegedly held seances with some of these lab assistants to look at mediumship. But one of the things that cropped into psychical research interest was this idea that he was building a device that could contact the dead. And he gave an interview in 1920 to Scientific American, which I think as a magazine is still going to this day. But he said, I'm going to build this device. It's going to have very sensitive equipment. And so if the mind does survive beyond death, it just needs this delicate instrumentation. And at the very least, it's going to give the dead a chance to get in contact with the living. But he died in 1931. And so 11 years later, there's no evidence of such a machine coming to the forefront, certainly not commercialized, that everyone could go out and buy this telephone to contact the dead. But then there were dribs and drabs of whispers and ideas that blueprints came forward and a partially built machine. I think the Thomas Edison Museum is in Texas, and one of their highest requests, if it is in Texas, I know it's somewhere, there is a Thomas Edison Museum in the United States. One of their highest requests is for blueprints or pictures of this device to contact the dead. And they have to turn everyone away because they say, we don't have such. So I think he was jumping on the bandwagon because there were a lot of people around 1919 to 1920 that were professing that they had made a device to contact the dead. There's a handful of people that D. Scott Rogo and Raymond Bayless wrote about in their book, Phone Calls from the Dead. And then I found even more to write in my book, Telephone Calls from the Dead. And so I think he thought, if this hits the ground and starts running and people are actually doing this, they're going to make a fortune. So I need to propose to such a prestigious outlet as Scientific American that I am working on such a device and it will be made and it'll surpass the others. So tried to jump on the bandwagon. Maybe he did make attempts because he seemed to be very serious about psychical research and seances, but nothing surfaced. So that's where Edison comes into this.
So that's great. I'm glad that you mentioned the Rogo person, because in an interview I had seen you speak about, you were on your way to meet his son, and you had an opportunity to go through all of his files. And is that correct?
No, I saw his father. Rogo was gay. He had no family whatsoever. He was a bachelor all of his life. So I went out to see his dad in Hollywood.
Oh, his dad. Okay.
Yeah.
But he left all of those files behind that you had the opportunity to go through?
Yeah, I mean, it was very weird. It was about 9 months before Scott was murdered in 1990 that he'd written his bequests to the Parapsychology Foundation. So Lizette Coley, who is the director, she received this from Scott. And I think he was murdered around the 16th of August, 1990. The exact date isn't quite clear because he'd been missing for about 2 days. But his father, Jack Rogo, sorted out having all of his books and files donated to the Californian Institute. I'm a lecturer for their parapsychology module in their master's degree. So yeah, I went out, where was I? I was in Southern California talking to the Life After Life Club. And that was headed and run by Dr. Elizabeth McAdams, who was my contact there. She was one of Raymond Bayless's students, and I think she'd met Scott a couple of times. I can't quite remember. But it's because there was a Southern Californian Society for Psychical Research. Scott and Raymond were both members of that. But Scott lived in Northridge in California, and his family home was in Hollywood, and Jack Rogo still lived at that family home. So after I was done in Southern California, I went up to Hollywood. It was the second and only time I'd met Jack. That was back in 2019. And I did another interview with him for about 2.5 hours, and we had a nice catch up. And then I went on to San Francisco to go and look through Scott's files, which was like 42 boxes I had to go through in 3 days. So I was really working around the clock to go through every envelope, every file, every piece of paperwork, listening to cassette tapes, trying to get everything I needed to start to sculpt a biography of his work and life and find anything else on the telephone call phenomena. And it was really fortunate. It was like Jack was holding on, because Jack passed away 2 weeks later. So the fact that I managed to speak to him for 2.5 hours about Scott and everything, and even go back on his history when he was a 16-year-old at Pearl Harbor the day it was bombed. And he went out to a lot of schools and colleges and used to talk about Pearl Harbor because of it. So he was a very kind guy, very generous with his time. And I miss Jack. It was nice that I had him as a contact and a link to Rogo. But now my main link now is via Rogo's brother, Jeff. His daughter, Meredith, is the one who holds all the rights to Scott Rogo's books. So the one we struggled with the most was Phone Calls from the Dead, because the other side of those rights was Raymond Bayless. And Raymond had no children. And no family after that. I've even got Raymond's paintings hanging in my house that I brought back from Southern California and Las Vegas. I've got about 5 or 6 of them that they're massive, absolutely beautiful. So we struggle with Raymond's rights to get this book redone because it's not been reprinted since 1979 and everyone wants a copy of it. We've only just this year managed to resurface and get permission for such rights, and Meredith holds the rights for Rogo. So I've been handwriting out page by page the original book to get it back out, get it reprinted. And I'm trying to write a lengthy postscript to that so people know where the phenomenon has been researched following that point. So it links to my modern work and then what's been done after that second book as well. So that's a very long answer to it, but it wasn't Scott's son. I went and saw Scott's dad, and I went out to San Francisco where his files are held in the Rockefeller Library at the Californian Institute for Integral Studies.
Well, that's an interesting story, to work under pressure like that and to be by yourself, with documents that are so precious, it's just a lot of pressure, and you had the chance of being able to see any of that. For the fact that it was in more modern times, were you able to take photographs of his writings, or did you how did you just try to speed up whatever hours you had? Could you just grab your cell phone, or did they confiscate that too,
No, if I did that, that would be very naughty. And I didn't do that. What I had to do, because it was so strict, I got permission from Jack, which was the main thing. So they knew that ultimately they got the best biographer there to be handling Scott's material. And I kind of helped them out by, when I went through each box, I was using sticky notes and I would label Scott, box number 2 is linked to box number 7. Because you've got items there that should be placed with this one. Because they got a basic filing system, and I went through it quite thoroughly. And there's a picture of me stood in the section where they kept all the boxes. They've been moved to another archive site now, but I'm stood there with Heather, who was looking after, she was in charge of the archive. And when you look at us stood there, you see the row of boxes, and they've all got pink and green sticky notes on that. I did all of them. And they're everywhere, but they're all notes linking one box to the other. So if you've got a piece of string, you just see this kind of spider diagram thing going everywhere. But what I had to do was, if I needed something, I got this kind of call sheet, and with a pencil, I had to mark box whatever, and then I'd note what item it was and whether I needed one copy or a certain page. And it was a long system. So now up on my shelf, I've got some of those items printed, and I've got 2 pen drives they sent me just full of all these documentations that I needed. So it works like that sometimes with the library, where it's very heavily guarded. It's not been looked through properly, so they don't even know what's fully in there. So I was the first person to go through it fully. But then you've got other instances where the University of Virginia and their Division of Perceptual Studies, Bruce Grayson, who you might have heard of for near-death studies, and Jim Tucker's there. You've met Jim Tucker. He was at the Forever Family Foundation Afterlife Conference. Jim was there. Raymond Bayless's stuff got donated there. And I contacted Bruce again recently. And I said, how are you getting on with the box? There are things that I need. And he got his new research assistant to give me an itemized list of what was in there. And I just went, oh, this is a treasure trove. And I said, do you mind? All of these, I listed loads of things. I said, these are kind of the main things I need, but I'd love to see it in person. And he said, just leave it with me. And they've copied the lot, everything that I needed. So I've already on my desk over here, the dining table, I've got loads of printouts of correspondence between Scott and Raymond. So handwriting in a lot of those, and then others are typewritten. And then the other pile are all the letters that Raymond Bayless sent out to every parapsychologist he could think of, asking for instances of phone calls from the dead if they had any on file, which I'd heard about over the years, that was what Raymond was tasked to do, but I'd never seen such letters and didn't know if they existed still, and they do. So I've just started reading through them, and it's just been amazing. Not only kind of realizing who he wrote to and what their responses were, but also how Scott's mannerisms. He'd be very open and blunt with Raymond in his private correspondence as to what he thought of people, and he'd give him live updates from conferences, but in postal correspondence. I met so-and-so today, I sat at dinner with them, God, they're this or that. And, they're so up themselves, or they think this, and I don't reckon much to them, or this guy's absolutely lovely, but boy, is he bonkers. He's absolutely crazy, but he's so lovable. And these are all various scientists that I know very well, or they're past now. And Scott is just being very kind of, he's very, I want to use some other words, but I don't know what I can get away with.
That's
but he's
okay.
just,
we got it.
Scott's being his temperamental, argumentative, ready to cause a fight self, which is what Scott was known for.
Well, that is really special that you have all of that. I just wanted to link your book, Telephone Calls from the Dead, to their previous work. So you had heard about their work, or you had studied their work, and then you decided to take the same concept and maybe survey or maybe ask for a group of people for their recall. And what is the size of, when you do any research, you have to have your subjects, right? So what is the size of the total amount of subjects were in on your research?
They found 50 accounts, and they went through every book and journal they could think of to find them, and then follow up with people if they could. And then their other tactic was what Raymond did. They wrote to people and asked for cases that they likely had on file. And I did similar. So at that point, the Californian Institute for Integral Studies was already helping me with what was in Scott's files. And they initially went through the phone call files, which I knew that they had. So they sent me additional cases after 1979, which is when their book was published, so I could look at those, assuming that later on Scott and Raymond were going to write about them. But they didn't. Scott did another chapter on this phenomena in his 1986 book, Life After Death. And Raymond did another chapter in his 1981 book with Elizabeth McAdams called The Case for Life After Death, Parapsychologists Look at the Evidence. And there's nothing new in it. They're just outlining what the phenomena is with a few examples. So these extra cases, I included them in my sample. And I asked people about their cases, and they got sent to me. So I had another 50 cases or so to analyze. In social science, we call it a thematic analysis. So it's taking a group of interviews and transcribing them, or written script, looking for codes through reading them over and over again. And then eventually those codes start to justify themes. And we already knew from the first book that they had these different themes of types of telephone calls and how they played out. So part of my task was looking to see if they still exist, those kinds of themes. So they recognized characteristics of how a call happens, or was there anything else going on? So my book, Telephone Calls from the Dead, which came out in 2012, and it's just been re-released as a second printing because it completely sold out back in 2018. And it's taken me ages to work on it to bring it back out again, just to preserve it as a print on demand and Kindle. I mean, I love the first edition because it had embossed covering and stuff, but I couldn't go down that route again. I hadn't got the time. I hadn't got the finances to pay privately for a backlog of books again, or the time to search for a publisher to do it justice. But then there was a whole royalties question of how much would you get back for all the hard work going for such a mainstream publisher. You'd need demand for the topic. So it's preserved on print on demand through Amazon. But I kind of outline the phenomena in the first chapter. In the second chapter, I tell you about Rogo and Bayliss. And then from chapter 3 onwards, it's a new analysis. And so I go through it all again, what kind of skepticism we need to apply to any research of these claims. And then later on, I bring in what is new compared to 1979, and what's new is text message, what's new is email, and then also looking at computers. And when I wrote it, though, it was about 2011 when I wrote it, and I started writing about it in 2010. iPhones were only just coming in at that point. People were just starting to use them more popularly, and phones that have access to the internet. And so, little did I know, even though I knew it was advancing rapidly, phone technology, that after it got published, then iPhones every few months were getting better and better. And now we've got all kinds of fancy phones, ones that fold and ones that have got incredible 4K imagery for watching films and stuff like that on without any glitches. Back in 2010, the Wi-Fi could be really dodgy, and trying to get a GPS signal to use it for, as a sat nav in your car, it was getting there, and you could see it was getting a lot better. So eventually I do need to do a new revised book, a new title. I don't know what it would be, Phantom Phone Calls or Phone Calls from Beyond. I can't think of many titles that still make the message clear that this is about phones and strange experiences, but dropping so much the idea of them being from the dead, because there is a mixture of unusual experiences that aren't from the dead. One of the classic ones that Scott had was what they call intention calls. And so his account was, it was 10 o'clock on a bright Thursday morning, and I thought about making a call to a friend of mine at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute. Although I thought about making the call, I never actually did. I decided to do some other work instead. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, though, I got the shock of my life when a call came in to me from the office of the very psychologist I'd thought about calling. The caller was their research assistant, saying that he was answering my message. When I asked what in blazes he was talking about, he said that at 10 o'clock that morning, a call had come into them from me. The caller had left my name, my number, and asked that the call be returned. So you have the intention to call and then don't, and yet the person you intended to call still receives something. So there's a whole variety of different cases in there. Rogo and Bayliss talked about them. I've talked about them. But then when I take this book forward to another book that'll be just completely revamped, it will be more chapters. It's a complete rewrite. Phone Calls from the Dead and Telephone Calls from the Dead act as a sort of volume 1 and 2 over 30-year span. What I do next will be something different, but there's those cases. I'll need to talk about AI. AI is coming into everything now, artificial intelligence for all sorts. Even when you go on a website and you use a chatbot, whether it's to do with medical problems or anything, they're trying to improve those to make them more human-like in their responses, even for things like sex therapy. When people don't want to go and speak to a sex therapist face-to-face, well, people might want to do that online and get some advice, but they still want it to seem very human. And so we know things are getting very much like that. One of the things I find fascinating is when they can take someone's voice that is so well recorded. I heard Ozzy Osbourne recently, and that they strip that voice and they put it to another song they've never sung. And you just think, oh my goodness, you can hear him singing a Queen song or something like that. So it's very scary how far that's going. And there have been a few TV shows and dramas under this idea that a loved one dies, but an app comes out that has stored all the phone calls they ever made to you. So it strips their voice. And then with this app, you can call them whenever you like and have conversations with them. But the creepy limitation was that personality would only be based on what was stored in the phone. Their secrets, their private life, their other side, or aspects that you knew about them, it'd be missing from the sequence because it was never on CCTV. It was never said on the phone. So that there's a kind of a creepy missing element to a person that would never be fully digitized, that you would recognize either by person or by a spirit contact. If you saw their apparition, you go, that's absolutely them, or recognize them through a mediumistic reading. It's because of a certain quality that only you would know about. And so this idea of an AI version seemed to have a creepy missing link to it.
Yes, you bring up a really big point, because in doing medium readings, the main aspect that we focus in on is to provide evidence of spirit. And evidence of spirit is primarily based on their personality. When we bring through a cause of death, we bring through information that only they would know, either a very particular nickname they had in the family or a particular circumstance that happened in their life, but really how they come across. And even sometimes when I watch film where someone is filming me and I'm giving a reading, I literally take on their personality. The way I move my head, the way I maybe even mention a statement that they had said. I did a Forever Family Foundation public reading, and someone that I was reading for said that was exactly the same sentence that she would always use. So sometimes when you're able to get down to such detail of the person's life, that person, again, resonates with the family to say that's definitely, without a question of my mind, that's definitely my family member. So that piece that you talk about with AI, that's what it's lacking. It's lacking the humanistic capability, even though it's picking up those words I understand that. It's actually a little astonishing that people would actually want that because it's not really genuine. There's a cross between that. So I'm a little astonished that people would be interested in that. To me, it
was a TV drama, but the idea is there in terms of would this eventually become a possibility in terms of
I could see it happening easily.
An app that people want. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. People want things that I would never understand why they would want it. There's a lot of things out there. But there's one thing that you had said earlier that I want to circle back to, and it's the intention call. Because I can't tell you how often this happens to me. It may not be exactly like an intention call, but I'll think about someone earlier that day and I'll say, I definitely have to call them. Before I'm leaving work, they're calling me. And they're saying, you just popped in my mind, and I just had this feeling I needed to talk to you today. What's going on? And I'm like, oh, wow, that's weird, because I was thinking of you today, and I felt like I needed to call you. So that's not intention. Is that more psychic calling?
That's more what Rupert Sheldrake describes as like a telephone telepathy. And more so if the phone is ringing and you go, it's them, because you've just been thinking about them or you thought about them that day. And so Rupert went through to testing that, where, you could have 4 or 5 potential callers that and you're in another room, the telephone rings, and you have to declare who you think it is before you pick up. And then you say hello. If anyone goes to, I think it's sheldrake.org or rupertsheldrake.org, he's got an online test. So you can try this at home with your friends because he's collecting data through you doing that. So you can do online experiments on his website, and it will set up an experiment if you put your telephone numbers in, and you can try a telephone telepathy experiment. And it works with text messages and emails as well. But he's done loads of studies of this over time, and then it's been replicated by well-known skeptics such as Professor Chris French and Professor Richard Wiseman. It's an interesting phenomenon, very, very common, much like the sense of being stared at as well, which, of course, doesn't involve any technology, apart from the idea of, well, can you also tell that when someone's staring at you through CCTV? We get that in a lot of supermarkets. You have a security guard usually at the front or in a side office. When they're watching out for shoplifters, does it make a difference? Does the shoplifter seem to have some sort of intuition that they're being watched, but not directly? It's indirectly. And a lot of these security guards will say, you know what, the moment I start watching them on the camera, they've just taken something off the shelf, they start to put it back and change their mind. Is it because they felt something's not quite right here? It's because you're being watched.
That's really interesting. That is really interesting. There's one thing I want to go back, because it's something that I know, that other people may be thinking of or questioning. When you say phone calls of the dead, we kind of have to break this down a little bit into smaller bites, maybe. The person has been deceased. How long are they deceased by the time these phone calls are occurring? Because I did see there was a video that you had been featured in, and it showed a TV show that aired maybe in the 80s, and it was kind of like like they kind of went through it, like a reenactment of what happened with the person. And the person actually, it was a woman, she was in the kitchen, and she picks up the landline phone.
Oh, Mary Meredith.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. So can you tell that story? I think that's really interesting.
That was a series called In Search Of, and then it would put a title on the end of it because they were in search of various things, and it was hosted by Leonard Nimoy from Star Trek. And that was the one episode where Scott Rogo was in it. And so he introduces Scott Rogo, and Scott's filmed, I think, in the ASPR library. I can't remember the exact case, but it's to do with... She answers the telephone and she's absolutely shocked because the person on the phone says, it's your cousin. And she said, you can't be my cousin. My cousin is dead. And she just received a letter to inform her that her cousin had died in the hospital. And she said, I knew you were in the hospital because I was there with you. And just that the events don't tie up right. And she just thought this person was being quite horrible and pranking her in this way. But it was a very persistent call. And the letter kind of helped demonstrate that call should not have happened in the way that it did. So anyone interested in that should either get out the series In Search Of, or maybe you could post a link to that exact lecture that I did so they can actually see that video for themselves as well. But yeah, that's the one and only demonstration of someone talking about their own case back from the 1970s. And it's beautiful because you see the footage of Scott Rogo in it, and there's not much footage of him openly kicking around. It'll be in a lot of TV studio archives in the US where he appeared on programs such as That's Incredible and a few other shows as well.
Yes, I'm glad you mentioned it, because I was actually taken back, because in that reenactment, she gets so upset she hangs up the phone, and then they call back. And that's the piece that got me. I was like, oh my gosh, and it was the same person, the same connection. So it wasn't like it was a different voice. It was, she recognized the voice, and that's what kind of really alarmed her.
Yeah, I mean, that's unusual. You don't get many cases where if you hang up, they'll call back like that. So it's strange that it's persistent in that way. There are a variety of different ways in which they take place. And your initial question was, how long is it? Well, it could be anything from the moment of death. There's been people I've spoken to that at the moment they're sat at the bedside of the person, their phone starts acting weird, or they've had a call from them, and yet their phone's dead and it's by the bedside. So why are they getting a call from them that's flashing up their name on their modern phone? Through to, days, weeks, months, or sometimes years afterwards as well. So there's no real time limit on it, to be honest, that they seem to happen at a variety of different instances. And that's like any phenomena post-death. You can have things happening within what's called the crisis period, which we're writing on at the moment. We did a big survey for an after-death communication project a few years back, and our main survey is published in the British Journal of Psychiatry Open, BJ Psych Open. And we surveyed over 1,000 people in English, French, and Spanish languages, and now we're doing Chinese, Dutch, and German. But there were a lot of sort of telephone call related case. But these crisis cases are, you get an experience, you could wake up and see the apparition of Uncle Bob, who lives in Australia, and he's clutching his chest and falling over. And you get an email the next day to say that he died during the night. And the time sync from Australia to where you are is perfect for the time that you woke up seeing this. He was clearly in crisis. He was dying, but you had no knowledge there was anything wrong with him. It's the apparition and what he was doing that's the information to you that was happening, which is why when you get the email, you think, oh my goodness, that explains the experience. So that's usually within a 12-hour before death, 12-hour afterwards. But it can happen decades afterwards as well, but then it's not a crisis because you're fully aware that person has been dead for a long time. But you're usually in an instance where you're not thinking about them. It just happens.
The crisis information that you're speaking about, I can kind of resonate with that a little bit, but it didn't come through a phone. It came through a TV. In my life, my cousin, who was very close to me like a brother, I went to the house and he was actively dying, and I left before he died. And I went to bed. It was been about 11 o'clock. And, I just said out loud, I really hope that you move on, because it was very painful for everyone that was at the bedside, and painful. The whole experience is difficult when someone's in that situation. I fell asleep, and I had like a regular TV program on, like the news. And it must have been around 1 o'clock in the morning. And I literally, my eyes popped open and my head looked right at the TV. And the TV was on a different channel. Now I have cable, and it went to like this country station, and Diamond Rio is a country band, and there was a song playing. And I literally stood up in my living room and I stared at the TV and I said, okay, Tommy, I know you're past now, because over all these years, he used to tease me for being a heavy metal, rock and roll, whatever. And he always forced his country on me, And, I just looked at the time, and it was, around 1 o'clock in the morning. And by 6 o'clock in the morning, when I was getting ready to go to work, I work at a hospital, I got a text that, Tommy passed around 1 o'clock in the morning. And I knew it already because I saw Diamond Rio right there on the TV. So have you heard anything like that with the TV set?
Oh, you remind me of two things. Let me tell you this one first, because you just reminded me. It's completely unrelated in terms of an odd experience, but Lloyd Auerbach, who you've been attending classes for with the Rhine Research Centre, he was at some event. He told me, because I recorded the interview when I was collecting stuff for Scott's biography, but it was at some event, and he and Scott Rogo drove somewhere just to go and get a drink. They said, let's go to a bar. And I'm sure they were somewhere unfamiliar, so they were just picking anywhere, and they went into a bar. And as soon as they went in, it's like going through the saloon doors and everyone stops and looks at you because you're a stranger from out of town. But they went in and it was like country western. And they just looked at each other and just went, no, and walked out. I just think country western was just totally not either of their scenes. I went out, and I just love that, you know, Scott was quite elusive, and the fact that he got on with Lloyd like that is really quite nice. But TVs, some people have claimed experiments with instrumental transcommunication through them. I think I mentioned one instance or two in Telephone Calls from the Dead, where people heard voices through the TV speaker, believing to be their deceased loved ones. Raymond Bayless had certainly written about it in an article. And you have famous depictions in things like the film Poltergeist with Carol Ann, when she goes downstairs and the TV turns itself on, it's just the static. And she's talking to it. She can hear voices in the static that are kind of going, whispering back and forth. And she's talking to her grandma as well, who's passed away, which is really sweet. She's speaking to this deceased people in that one, and then it's in the second one, she's got the toy telephone, and her grandma passes away that night, and she doesn't know her grandma passed away.
That's correct.
And she speaks to her on the toy telephone, and it's so sweet. You want a, tear-jerking moment because, I'll be good. Don't worry. And then like, oh, Carol Ann, that's so sweet. But in the first one, she's speaking to all kinds of deceased entities on the television, and then they turn quite nasty, but you can't hear. You can hear this sort of a murmuring, but she can hear because she's psychically intuitive. And then it's the parents come down and watch her doing it, and she turns around and goes, they're here. And that's what starts it all off. So there's that. I had a strange experience once when Ron Kolick, I don't know if you've ever encountered Ron Kolick or been interviewed by him. He does the New England Ghost Project and Ghost Chronicles and Ghost Chronicles International. And I can't remember for the life of me the house that he put me up in. It's a kind of a manor house in New England. And very, very old, claims its own ghost. And I was up in an old room where just complete wooden building, very old furniture in this hotel room. It's just like you were staying in someone's old grand house. And the television, my God, it was like a 1970s US television. Everything was kind of clunk, clunk, clunk to change. You had to turn a dial. I never used the television while I was there. It's still got the aerial on top. I thought, how is this still in a hotel room? And I was in bed during the night, and 2 a.m., bang, absolute cracking. I woke up and thought, what the hell is that? And looked, and the television, which is right at the end of the bed, it had turned on, and it was just on static. And it was just the static screen. And it was there was sometimes when a TV went to the AV channel by accident, like when you were switching from using the video player back to the normal channels, you would get a crash of static, and it would turn itself up to the highest volume. This was me just waking in the middle of the night to the fact that the TV had turned itself on and was on the static. So it was the loudest. I had to get out of bed and just unplug it to turn it off. It was nearly like in Poltergeist, where they just wheeled it outside the room at the end. They didn't want it in the room anymore.
Wow.
But that was odd.
That is really odd. Well, it's kind of interesting because I always tell people, when you're sensitive or when you're involved in this, I almost feel like it's attracted in some way. Like, so did you speak to anyone in the house the next morning and share that or anything?
If I did, and the other people that I was there with, I think it just went over the head of the person who owned the guest house, because they were very particular, the person that owned it anyway. They were quite a character, but I think given the fact that their main advertising, their main income was from doing talks and having people there and stuff like that, it just, it is what it is. You're in a haunted mansion. That's the kind of stuff that happens here. What do you want me to say? So not really much came out of that conversation. And, for me, not much paranormal has happened there. There could be a number of conventional explanations, but I'm not an electrician. I did lousy kind of jobs when I did an electronics course when I was at college. I didn't do very well at all. I could build basic circuit boards. So, there could be a reason why it came on like that. I just wanted to go back to sleep and didn't want to have the telly keep waking me up. So I turned it off at the plug, so it wasn't possible to do it again.
That's
no
terrific.
Power. Now, if it had come back on again without any power to it, that would have been interesting.
Then you would have been back in your bags. Well, it's interesting. I do most of my readings by Zoom because we've had the pandemic, and then most people I'm reading for are living around the world. And just recently, within the past month, I sit here in my living space and everything is off. I'm completely locked in doing my reading. And in the middle of my reading, the TV behind me turned itself on. And the person I was reading for saw me. I leaped out of my chair. I spun around and I said, "Did you see that?" And I literally had to pick up the remote control to turn it off. And I sat down and she was laughing. And I said, "I can't believe that. Like, I don't use a timer." And I automatically went back to, Lloyd and John and all these guys that are talking constantly about negating things. Like, you always have to remove, like, what could have something been. And I said, "I can't explain that." And she said something like, her family member was, like an engineer or something. So she accepted that as part of her reading. And afterwards, I thought to myself, wow, I cannot say that's happened before, because on her tape, you could see me literally jump up and turn around. Like, it was so obvious. So what would you explain that? Like, if I was in the middle of a reading, you can't, I can't negate it. I can't not negate it. I don't know what to say.
I don't know. I mean, it's like with a lot of cases, I'll go and do talks and I'll get a queue of people coming up and, they'll want to buy a book that I've written, but at the same time, they'll then say, "I've got to tell you this." And there's a queue of people behind. There could be like 20 people, and this person wants to tell me a 20-minute story. And, this is why when I go and do talks and events, I'll try and either like book in there for the night and stay there and say, "I will stay here as long as you want. If you want to one by one tell me your story." So, if you want a book, get a book. If you want to tell me a story, hang around and go and get a drink, because I'll come and meet you in the bar or wherever. But ultimately, with some of these, it's very hard when people say, "Explain that." Well, I wasn't there. I don't know exactly where it was. It sounds very interesting. Right. I'm sure you looked for conventional explanations, Exactly. But I'm a psychologist, not a TV repairman. I'm not the cable guy.
Exactly. Yeah.
I can't tell you exactly what happened, but it sounds very coincidental, and it was very meaningful, clearly, to you with what you were doing and that happening at the same time. But is it just pure coincidence? And to understand that, we'd have to have a bit of psychology for what you were doing and someone who knows TVs and electronics very well.
Yes, yeah. Well, I really appreciate it, because I was more... I was different-minded before getting involved in the Forever Family Foundation. And as I got involved with the Forever Family Foundation, I learned to look at things in a very scientific way. And I think that it's really helped me, but it's also helped me explain things to other people. Not everything is significant. It has to mean something, or you have to feel something literally, like it has to physically resonate with you. So I've really appreciated the work that the foundation has done, because they really connect with people that are subject matter experts. That's why, like, Lloyd laughs all the time. Even when I was in the military, people would send me a picture with something in the picture, and I'd say, "Hang on," and I'd send it to Lloyd. He'd be the one to, say this is something for real or not. And 9 times out of 10, he would say no. He's only actually agreed to maybe one photograph that I sent to him. So he's very tough, and he's really an expert in it. But I just wanted to touch on just we have a couple of more things to cover. But before we close the interview, I want to make sure that people know where to find you. Also, that they're able to find your book and where your book, and if you're doing any kind of speakings and stuff.
Every time you mention Lloyd, I keep thinking of his psychic gopher. Oh, I missed that. Oh, I need to write. We need to write something on ghosts together, Lloyd and I. I'll get back to him soon. I haven't messaged him in a while. But there's my website, callumecooper.com. So I'm known as Dr. Cal Cooper. Cal is the name that I go by, but like a lot of academics, we use our full name and our middle initial to distinguish from anyone else. So, I've kind of missed the boat if I wanted all my books to be down as Cal Cooper, because that's been the more casual thing. So it's annoying going between the two names, but all my writing is as Callum E. Cooper, and my website. And you'll find me on Twitter, which is now X, under that name as well. So you can see the things that I'm up to. I tend to give a lot of updates on there. I've just started using Instagram, but I really don't like it as much as Twitter. I'm just not as familiar with Instagram, and same naming as well on there. With Amazon, you will find all of my books on there. The main one that we've spoken about in this interview is Telephone Calls from the Dead. So that's come back out as a second printing. So it's the 2024 edition, and it first came out in 2012. It's on there as a paperback and as a Kindle. Some people have even emailed me requests for signed copies. So I will do that. If you get in contact with me directly, I can sort out doing a signed copy and posting them to wherever you need them posting. My other books on there are things like Conversations with Ghosts with Alex Tannis. It was a posthumous publication for him, so I finished off some of his writings, and I need to revise that book at some time. There's Paracoustics, edited with Steve Parsons, and we're just, in the next few months, finishing up on Paravision, which is the accompanying book to that. As you mentioned, I've done Science Psychotherapy. That was another Alex Tannis book that I edited together. And then I've done forwards for different books that I've worked on. Craig Wheeler has done a book called Psi Wars. I did the forward to that. Scott Rogo's books are coming back out again. So his book, Parapsychology, A Century of Inquiry, I did a very short forward for that book as well. And there are other ones. So the original Phone Calls from the Dead will be back out again eventually. So go to Amazon, go to my website, go to Twitter. You'll find me, Cal Cooper, Callum E. Cooper.
Any public appearances either here or in the UK?
There's loads in the UK coming up. So next Tuesday, I'll be in Cambridge at Skeptics in the Pub in the evening. And then I'll be at Greenwich Skeptics in the Pub with Professor Chris French in June. I think I've got a few talks coming up in Edinburgh in May. I'll be at the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Centre, and then possibly the Edinburgh Fortean Society around that time. And I know there are talks later on in the year. I need to sort out more for the USA. So the Life After Life Club in Southern California, they want me back there. I've probably got another trip due out to Las Vegas again before long. But I was speaking to Alice Kelly, who's one of Alex Tannis's nieces, and she's the research officer for the Alex Tannis Foundation. I do want to get back out to Durham and go to the Rhine Research Centre again and, make a whole weekend thing of it, do like several talks, not just one.
I will be looking forward to you coming back to the States. I just wanted to thank you again for doing this interview. It's been amazing. You're really an incredible researcher and a subject matter expert, to say the least. Can you just explain the song that we're going to be rolling into? I think you picked this song.
So I've picked Erasmus with him and with Apocalyptica. So 3 different bands together. And this song is called Bittersweet. And if you see the music video, between the 2 singers from him and Erasmus, they're moving a Ouija board, and they're getting in contact with the deceased girl that they've fallen in love with. And so that's what the song's about. It's about falling in love with a deceased girl.
Okay, great. Well, we're going to roll out, and thank you again. Take care, Cal.
Take care, Kathy. Thank you.
Thank you.
On devotion.